So this week, we are continuing reading from the Gospel of Luke, and we're now in chapter 7. I'm going to read the first 10 verses, so listen for God's word to us here today. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There, a centurion servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. And I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him and turned to the crowd following him. He said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith, even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. So this is we're now in the 7th chapter. That's verses 1 through 10. And as I was reading it, I was kind of thinking about Jesus' role in this passage and how it shows new things. In my own life, I have 3 teenagers, and I've been learning a lot of new language from them, mostly good language. And I try to use it with them also, both to understand them, but also to torment them. So they don't love it when Dad calls something like sus or cringe, or talks about something being cap or slaying. These are kind of all words that I might hear in my house in a week. And if Dad says the word cringe, it's pretty cringe, which means cringeworthy. Sus is suspicious, cap is a lie, slaying is doing really great. These are all terms that I hear now. And recently I heard another term called overpowered. And not everybody knows it. I think it's kind of like a gaming and movies term. And when I first mentioned overpowered, Eva, my daughter, even knew like an abbreviation for it. She went like OP, like OP is like overpowered. Mike Kivett was remembering, for our generation, OP was Ocean Pacific. It was like a t-shirt you wore. But for this generation, OP is overpowered. And it seems to get used in like 2 main contexts. One is video games and the other is movies. So in a video game, it might describe an object that's like super powerful and changes how you play the game. Like if you have a sword that maybe you're killing orcs, if it helps you kill all the orcs and they can't defend themselves, it's an overpowered sword. Or if you have armor that can't be broken in any way, you'll never die, so it's an overpowered armor. And this also happens in movies. There are characters who are kind of overpowered. Like I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, so I remember like the Keanu Reeves movie was so cool because he could like dodge bullets in slow motion, and he could fly, and he could jump over things. He was kind of overpowered. And then on my phone, Google recommends articles, and you can tell I'm a nerd. It told me about the new Superman movie that's coming out, and it talked about how Superman is OP, right? Like Superman he's a hard character to write for because bullets bounce off of him, and he can run faster than the speed of light, and has laser vision and ice breath and can hear things. Like he's overpowered. So my basic argument for today's passage is that this is when we start to realize in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus is also overpowered, that he's not like the other leaders and teachers. He's got something more powerful that's happening with him. So as we turn to chapter 7, we see Jesus traveling through Galilee, his hometown. He's been healing people and doing miracles and casting out demons. The last couple of months, we've seen some of these stories. In chapter 4, there's a time where Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law's fever. And Jesus casts out demons on the Sabbath and heals on the Sabbath. And there's the large catch of fish in chapter 5 as a miracle. and also cleansing a leper and a paralytic. And then in the last chapter, chapter 6, there's also a healing on the Sabbath. And in all of these stories, Jesus is doing something that's amazing. He's doing things that are really cool, but they're probably still within the bounds of what people might have expected from a religious leader or a prophet or a magician in that time period. In the first chapters of Luke, Jesus is healing and doing miracles, but he may not have seemed all that different. In Jesus' day, there was no Ohio health system, there was no urgent care, no ER room you could go to, no minute clinic, and probably instead, all around there would have been different healers and prophets and magical figures who would try to help you with your ailments. When I was in grad school, I did a book review that kind of talked about this context, and it sounds super boring. It was called Magic and Paganism in Early Christianity, and it was written by a German academic at the University of Chicago named Hans Josef Klauck. So originally I read it, I thought it would be pretty boring, but it's actually what it is it's a description of all of the supernatural stories in the book of Acts. Like it goes through Acts and it looks at all of these different figures that appear, like magicians and spirit mediums and healers and exorcists. And it sees speaking in tongues and resurrection. All these different things happen in the book of Acts when the disciples are confronting the people from the other religions and teachings in the area. So these alternative religious leaders, they also tried to heal and do small miracles in the book of Acts, but you can see something different in what Jesus' disciples do. Like the power of Jesus, the power of the Holy Spirit is a more powerful energy, a more powerful gift of God that's used over and over again. So my guess is that in the beginning of Luke, when we see Jesus show up, at first people are still expecting him to just be another one of these little healers or magicians or small prophets. But as Luke and Acts shows, the power that comes from Jesus is different than what they had seen before. So I'm going to just kind of talk us through this chapter in several chunks. You can read along in your Bible or on your phone or just listen. And in chapter 6, Jesus starts to do things that nobody else can do. Up to now, everything Jesus has done is something others claim to have done. He stood next to people and he's healed them, or he's cast out demons, or he's done something that seems magical, like filling nets with fish. But today's lesson, what I thought was just amazing about it, is Jesus can heal someone long distance without going there or seeing them. He doesn't snap his fingers. He doesn't do anything. He just wills it and it happens. And then we're not reading on after this, but the story just after this is a story where Jesus encounters a widow who's lost her son, which would be a big challenge for a widow. If you had no husband and no son, you would be in real trouble. And Jesus takes pity on her and he resurrects that child, right? Like the boy comes back to life. So it's kind of a say the word and it will happen, and it happens. And I would like to think that if I were a disciple, this would be the period when I start to realize that Jesus is OP, like Jesus is different from the other rulers and leaders, so that he can say the word to heal someone and the person is healed, or that he can resurrect somebody who's died and they come back. So the story begins as Jesus was traveling in Capernaum, and verse 2 says that there a centurion servant whom his master valued highly was sick and about to die. And the centurion sends a group of Jewish elders to Jesus, asking for Jesus to heal a beloved servant. The centurion is the other main character in the story today. Centurions appear throughout the book of Luke and Acts. They show up 10 different times. They have some dramatic roles. It's a centurion who at the crucifixion says, "Surely this was the Son of God." Centurions were basically mid-level officers in the military who commanded around a century, which means 100 soldiers. They commanded 100 soldiers. And I don't know if I explained it well with the kids today, but probably a lot of their life would have been kind of those military drills, like marching with them, ordering them to do things. Like their life was highly regimented, and every moment of every day they had to follow orders, or they were giving orders. And you can imagine that for the marginal Jewish community, for this little Jewish community in the Roman Empire, centurions were figures who probably commanded respect. but they were also viewed with extreme caution. So if you live in an empire, you fear the police and the military because they have power and they can inflict suffering on ordinary people. And sometimes when I've traveled, I've had this experience where you're in a country and people are wearing a different uniform and they have guns. And it's, I would imagine that's how the Jewish people of the time viewed the Romans, that they viewed them as kind of scary people. So if a raid is ordered, or if taxes are collected at the point of a sword, if people are punished for crimes, then probably a centurion is part of the chain of command. If there's a conscription of troops and they want your sons, they want to take your sons off to fight, or if there's a riot or a community conflict, probably the centurion is part of dealing with that, right? So you can imagine that centurions were sort of a double-edged sword, that an abusive centurion could magnify suffering, while a capable one could make life a lot easier and better for everyone. So it's telling to me that this is one of the only stories in the Bible where an outsider just tells Jesus to do something, basically, and he just gets up and goes. Like when the centurion calls, Jesus doesn't hesitate or think twice, he just goes. So verses 3 through 6 say, "The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, 'This man deserves to have you do this because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue.' So Jesus went with them." So it's a pretty interesting story. We don't know exactly why the centurion approached Jesus. Perhaps the servant was Jewish and it was at the servant's request. Maybe the centurion had exhausted all other options and Jesus was the healer of last resort, like he'd already tried the concoctions and the blessings and the different magics that other people were doing. It may be that the centurion had helped the Jewish people, so he was trying to call in a favor. He was saying, like, "Oh, I've heard you have this great healer, send him to me." The Jewish leaders, and the centurion doesn't go himself. Instead, he deputizes a group of Jewish elders who are sent to intervene. And traditional societies are sometimes like this, where you might ask an in-between person to go and talk to someone because you're afraid of rejection or you don't want to impose on them or some other reason. But the centurion finds this way. He asks these Jewish leaders to come and speak to Jesus and to plead his case. So the next part of the passage says that Jesus was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to him. "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." So this part of the passage was just really interesting to me, that it now emerges that the centurion just dared not approach Jesus directly, that he had to send friends as intermediaries, and the centurion uses a term of high respect for Jesus. He calls Jesus Lord, which is something you wouldn't imagine that this military leader in an empire would call a rabbi from this small Jewish group Lord, but that's what the centurion calls him. The centurion is humble and is not wanting to approach Jesus directly. The centurion explains his own view of authority. Don't micromanage, just delegate. You tell this servant to go or come or do this or go and do that, and they'll do it. And the centurion shows faith in saying that Jesus need not even trouble himself. So the story concludes with the two final verses, 9 and 10. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd, followed him. He said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. So Jesus instantly heals the unseen, unmet servant. He also adds this commentary that he's not seen such great faith even in Israel. So I think this story also anticipates, Luke and Acts talk a lot about the Gentiles turning to Christ. And even centurions and soldiers of the Roman Empire will eventually become Christians. That, right on down the road to Constantine. This year is the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Creed written at Constantinople. So I don't know if that's not something we've had a big party for, but you can sort of see the point is that in this very beginning, in the first century, you see this beginning of the spread of the faith that will go south into Africa and east into Asia and north into Europe. And the centurion is an example of a kind of a good Gentile, of someone who is faithful to Christ and will respect him and try to follow him. So for me reading the story today, there were sort of three takeaways that I had. And they come from the three main sets of characters. The first one, of course, is Jesus. The second one is the centurion. And then I also didn't talk about it a lot, but I was interested in the third group were these intermediaries. One was the set of Jewish friends, Jewish leaders, and the other was the centurion's friends, who they don't get names, but they go between Jesus and the centurion. So my first theme comes from Jesus, that in this passage in Luke, we start to see that Jesus is a lot more overpowered than we knew. He's a lot more OP than we knew before. In the Gospels, the disciples never really get this until sometime after the resurrection. But it's becoming clearer and clearer that where things are headed. So Jesus heals and does miracles and teaches and befriends and intervenes, but he's also showing himself as bigger than we knew. And there's a famous phrase in Latin called Christus Victor, which is the idea that like Christ is victorious or Christ is all-powerful. And that's that's kind of, for a long time, Christians have said that Jesus is OP, Jesus is overpowered. And it's not like the Roman Empire, it's not that kind of victory. Instead, it's freedom, it's setting us free that comes from the power of God. So a second theme in today's story is that faith welcomes God to act. That the centurion's faith invites Christ to do something that he'd never done before. And Pastor Chris, I think originally he called this story the faith of the centurion. That's how it appears in many Bibles. Today for the children's sermon, it was kind of interesting. I was looking through all my children's Bibles to see how many of them talk about the centurion. And it is a little hard to explain. Like, not that many have the centurion in there because he's this kind of funny figure, right? Like, he's a military leader who follows Jesus. But the centurion is a powerful leader who has the ability to do great harm, but instead is presented as humble and trusting and faithful, that he cares for his dying servant. He builds a synagogue for the local Jewish community. He seems like he trusts in Jesus, that he calls him Lord. He's somebody who is relied upon and appreciated by those around him, even though he has capacity for great evil. So for me also, I think it's a helpful reminder to have that kind of trust in people, that to have trust both with people when I ask them to do something, to feel like I'm not going to micromanage them, that I think sometimes if you have somebody who's faithful with you and loves you and cares for you, you don't feel that sense of being micromanaged or being overseen. So I really appreciate that in this story, the centurion models faith in others. Like he'll send people and he knows they'll go. And I think in our society, we're in an age where maybe trust is something they've often said is falling, that we used to trust the media and we trusted government leaders and we trusted institutions. We had like a higher rate of trust in general. But nowadays there's a lot of cons and scams, and all the time we have to, it feels like we have to be more careful. Like it's harder to trust people, maybe especially people we don't know. So to me, that maybe makes the story even more compelling, is that the centurion trusts Jesus sight unseen, and Jesus repays that trust. As we said, centurions will reappear in Luke and Acts, often as trustworthy Gentiles who stoically do their jobs. Like they do everything they're supposed to do with dignity and respect for others. And I think it's also worthwhile for us to follow that faith that the centurion has, that sense of trust. And a third theme in today's story is the importance of intermediaries shown through those Jewish leaders and the friends of the centurion, who go back and forth between the centurion and Jesus. And I didn't spend a lot of time talking about them in today's sermon, but in church ministry, I'm often struck by the people who are trying to do good for their community, and they often have this like intermediary role or the sort of eager helper role. And I was thinking about that at Liberty this week. Like, I'm still pretty new to this congregation, and there's a lot of things where I don't always know how they'll happen. Like, sometimes we'll put something on the calendar, and I'll be like, will people cook the soup, or will they come to the meeting, or will this, whatever it is, I don't always know. But I've just been so impressed by the people. Even this last week, like, I met somebody who said, I'd like to volunteer at the church. What could I do? And they'll try to help out today at the 10:30 hour. Or when we did the soup meal this week, there were people that stayed afterwards and cleaned up everything, and we figured out all the kitchen gear together. Or they repainted part of our admin building that, Dan was doing painting the last few weeks also, and I just was impressed by that. Or we had a member of our care team that's making a spreadsheet for us. And these are all things where, like, people see a need and they just respond to it. And it sort of models that sense of faithfulness that I think we see in those good helpers, that they want to make the centurion happy, they want to make Jesus happy, they want to do what God is calling them to do. So sisters and brothers, I think we all have our part that we play in life. Sometimes our role is humble. Oftentimes it may seem like too much for us. But whether we're strong or weak, we trust that an all-powerful God guides us. So let us close the sermon with prayer. Let us turn to God. Holy God, we praise you for your power, which sometimes takes our breath away. You can heal without seeing, heal without going. Lord, give us faith like a centurion. Lord, give us a willingness to go when you call. Give us a willingness to follow where you lead. Amen.